C-SPAN for coverage of the presidential campaigns through Election Day. On C-SPAN, you'll see all aspects of the campaign process: the candidates, the voters, and the media. The presidential race continues on C-SPAN, your campaign headquarters.
Stay with us here on C-SPAN for a speech by the Republican presidential nominee, Vice President George Bush. That's coming up after we take a short break.
I'm Barbie Weinberg, President of the Washington Institute. Very happy to have you all here with us this evening. Mr. Secretary, Mr. Ambassador, colleagues, friends, and fellow trustees, tonight is a very significant occasion in the short history of the Washington Institute. It was less than 4 years ago that a small group of concerned private citizens founded the Institute. Their goal, as outlined in the original prospectus, was to, quote, articulate and sustain a balanced and realistic view of American national interests in the Middle East, close quote. It's a testament to their vision, to the farsightedness and generosity of the trustees of the Washington Institute, so many of them are here tonight, and to the brilliance and dedication of the Institute's staff, directed by Martin Indyk, that we come together for our third annual policy conference. On behalf of the trustees, let me say that we take great pride in holding our deliberations this weekend in the company of our nation's leading scholars, experts, and policymakers on the Middle East. And most of all, we take deep pleasure in opening our conference by honoring a man whose words and deeds over the past 6 years have been committed to nothing less than articulating and sustaining a balanced and realistic view of American national interest in the Middle East. As a research and educational foundation, the best way we, the Board of Trustees, could conceive of honoring our speaker this evening was to learn from him and to recall his name as well as his contributions to our country when we learn from other great statesmen in the future. Therefore, we are honored to inaugurate an annual lecture series to be called the George P. Shultz Lecture on Middle East Diplomacy. Each year, a distinguished statesman will be invited to deliver the Shultz Lecture, offering his or her wisdom and insight into the pursuit of diplomacy in that volatile but vital region. In establishing this lecture, we pay tribute to the man who, over the course of his term as Secretary of State, has redefined America's relationship with the Middle East, and our nation is better for it. If historians were to ascribe to George Shultz a Shultz doctrine in the Middle East, it might very well be that he, through force of will and tireless effort, has proven that the United States can maintain close, warm, and mutually beneficial ties with both our Israeli ally and our Arab friends at the same time. Casting aside the outmoded conventional wisdom about the Middle East, he has shown that America does not have to choose sides between Israeli and Arab, that both need and both want a listening ear and a helping hand in Washington. When George Shultz took office, Israel was racked by war in Lebanon and with Syria, and reeling from a debilitating spiral of inflation. He set out to assist Israel in achieving economic stability to ensure that Israel would be strong enough to deter war and to free itself from the bonds of economic stagnation. During his watch, he has supervised the growth of strategic cooperation with Israel to heights previously thought impossible. Cooperation that was cemented into American policy with the signing of a memorandum of understanding between the two countries on the 40th anniversary of Israel's founding. The United States and Israel maintain 3 separate joint working groups on political military issues, security assistance programs, and economic growth and free trade. As a result of George Shultz's efforts, ranging from managing a $1 billion emergency economic assistance program to helping Israel weather the painful process of austerity and retrenchment, to enhancing common efforts to defend against the scourge of terrorism and the spread of Soviet influence in the eastern Mediterranean Sea, Israel is healthier, more secure, and better able to serve as a valuable and democratic ally. And as historians will point out, contrary to the belief that it couldn't be done, George Shultz's tenure also witnessed at that same time the growth and enhancement of close bilateral and regional ties with many Arab states in the Middle East. Without fanfare, we mark this week the 10th anniversary of a momentous event, the signing of the Camp David Accords. But it is no exaggeration to state that we would not be able to rejoice in that occasion tonight without George Shultz having understood the value of shoring up the Egyptian-Israeli peace agreement as the bedrock upon which all future Arab-Israeli diplomacy must rest. He did this in 3 ways. First, he forged solid ties with the government of Hosni Mubarak and expanded them to include a budding bilateral strategic relationship with that most pivotal and powerful of Arab states. Second, he husbanded and counseled Cairo and Jerusalem through the periodic problems, including the Tabas dispute, that beset any 2 nations still in the early process of waging peace. And third, he championed the Egypt-Israeli peace treaty as the model for future peace agreements in the region. Egypt's readmittance to a position of leadership in the Arab world, Camp David intact, is at least partially a testament to George Shultz's unwavering commitment to that vision of equitable peace and mutual security. Elsewhere in the Middle East, America's interests have been well served under George Shultz's stewardship. Several years ago, we were awash in fears about the crescent of crisis, with the Middle East being engulfed by radical Islamic fundamentalism fomented by Iran. Though the future of radical Islam is still uncertain, it's clear that radical Iran is in retreat. The role of the United States in taking firm action to protect shipping in the Persian Gulf gave greater confidence in American strength and reliability, kept the Soviet Union from exploiting the Gulf War to expand its political and military influence in the area, and accelerated the conclusion of the Iran-Iraq War. And the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan is a Shultz success story with reverberations throughout the Middle East. While most of the world has remained silent, George Shultz has spoken out forcefully against the deadly scourge of chemical weapons and has castigated governments like Iraq and Iran, which flout both law and human decency when they rain horrible death upon enemies, and in the case of Iraq, even on their own Kurdish citizens. There may well be a second Shultz doctrine to emerge from the last 6 years, that terrorism doesn't pay. It hurts the perpetrator. His has been a principled position, a position manifested in his refusal to even consider asking Kuwait to knuckle under to the demands of the TWA hijackers, to supporting sanctions, and withdrawing the United States ambassador from Damascus when the Syrian regime was found guilty of trying to blow up an El Al passenger plane. And George Shultz took the lead in focusing world attention on Libya's terrorist activities. And when Gaddafi did not respond to economic sanctions and political entreaties to halt his state-sponsored terrorism, George Shultz accepted the fact that more needed to be done. America's raid on Libya 2 years ago quieted that outlaw regime, chastened Syria, and was applauded even throughout the Arab world. On his watch, he set an example of dedication and determination that trickled down throughout the Foreign Service, as evidenced by the tireless efforts of his many fine lieutenants here in this room tonight, and one who isn't, who was a friend of the Institute since its inception, the late Arnie Rafel. Arnie was an example of the finest the Foreign Service has produced, and under George Shultz, he received the encouragement and support to serve his country to the best of his ability, with dignity, wisdom, and courage. Secretary Shultz went to Lebanon in 1983, and out of the cauldron of Beirut, he personally fashioned a workable peace treaty between 2 war-ravaged nations, only to have it torpedoed by a Syrian leader who did not share his desire for peace. Over the course of the past turbulent year, he has evinced his dedication to peacemaking by traveling to the Middle East 4 times. On every trip to the region, he has spoken eloquently of America's unshakable commitment to Israel's survival and security, as well as an understanding and concern for Palestinian dreams and aspirations. The tenacity and determination with which George Shultz has approached the seemingly insurmountable hurdle of making peace between Israel and the Arabs has, by personal example and steadfastness, set a yardstick of commitment to the cause of peace. By Secretary Shultz's words and deeds, he has laid down principles for progress in the peace process that will be his lasting legacy. The peace that he has envisioned is not prefab. It must be built brick by brick. His peace is not imposed. It is to be the product of direct negotiations between parties. It is to be achieved by working with our friends, not against them. And let us not forget, it is a peace in which the United States plays an intimate and active role as matchmaker, broker, and supporter of every side that sides with peace. It's a reflection of the abiding truth of these principles that the Washington Institute's Presidential Study Group, co-chaired by Walter Mondale and Larry Eagleburger, a group of Republicans and Democrats, policymakers, scholars, and journalists, including the foreign policy advisors to both presidential candidates, has deliberated for nearly a year and has endorsed these Shultz principles in their report, titled Building for Peace, the first copy of which it was my honor to present to Secretary Shultz this evening. In December of 1983, George Shultz said, and I quote, "Every Secretary of State becomes a Middle East expert very rapidly, whether he wants to or not. Usually his training is a process of ordeal by fire, but the process has a healthy way of bringing you back to the basics of foreign policy, the importance of standing by principles and commitments to friends, the virtue of courage and steadfastness in the face of challenges, the uses and limits of power as a factor of diplomacy, and the need for a moral compass to steer you on a steady course throughout the turbulent waters." Unquote. Mr. Secretary, in the presence of Middle East experts and private citizens alike, I am proud to say that you have survived the ordeal of fire. You have lived by and you have lived up to the principles and commitments that you espoused. And the cause of peace and the interests of the United States are much the better for it. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my profound honor to welcome a distinguished American, our inaugural Shultz Lecturer in Middle East Diplomacy, Secretary of State George Shultz.
Thank you, Mrs. Weinberg. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much. Thank you. Mrs. Weinberg, I appreciate that generous introduction. I won't comment on it beyond saying that I appreciate it. It was really quite something and special. And I know this is a special audience of people who are here because you are interested in this subject. You have had experience in the subject, and so you combine the knowledge and experience that it takes to do anything with it. And at the same time, you deserve a serious speech, and a serious speech addressed to this kind of a group. So that's what you're going to get. No laughs, no punchlines, a serious speech. So see if you can pay attention. Decision time is approaching in the Middle East. In Israel and Lebanon, within the Palestinian community, and in the Gulf, choices will be made that will have a profound impact on the politics of the region and on the chances of settling conflicts peacefully. These decisions must be based on a dispassionate and cold look at reality. For nearly 9 months, the United States has highlighted a simple but far-reaching reality in the Arab-Israeli conflict. The status quo between Arabs and Israelis does not work. It is not viable. It is dangerous. It contains the seeds of a worsening conflict that threatens to inflict even greater losses on all sides in the future. The Arab-Israeli conflict is not static. Today, potentially far-reaching changes are taking place. But the fundamental nature of the conflict and the principles for resolving it have not changed. Indeed, continuity and constancy appear even more important in the process of resolving this conflict. The challenge facing the next administration will be to shape change by building on the fundamental constants. This will serve U.S. interests and enhance the prospects for peace. What is the shape of the Middle East today? The Palestinian uprising in the West Bank and Gaza has not altered the fundamental nature of the Arab-Israeli conflict. It's a reminder that comprehensive peace requires peace between Israelis and Palestinians. And it's a reminder that the status quo serves the interests of no party. Jordan's disengagement from the West Bank hasn't ended Jordan's involvement in the peace process. Jordan has its own interest to pursue. Jordan's border with Israel is the longest of any, and much of its population is related by family ties to residents in the West Bank and Gaza. The shaping of Jordan's role in negotiations and in a settlement are among the key issues that need to be assessed by all parties. Israel's upcoming elections only highlights the intense and continuing debate within that country about peace. People are taking a hard look at the prospects for peace, and they are asking hard questions. Should Israel trade land for peace? Will continued occupation affect the democratic and Jewish nature of the State of Israel? What should Israelis do about Palestinian rights? Are other Arabs ready to accept Israel as a neighbor and make peace? The options before the Palestinians also have not changed. Palestinians are grappling with tough choices. Should they renounce terrorism and violence and choose a political course toward peace? How should they move beyond empty slogans toward realistic and responsible positions to give new life to the peace process? Elsewhere in the region, change and constancy are key words. In Lebanon, a new president is scheduled to be elected amidst hopes that this will give a push to the process of national reconciliation. All Lebanese recognize the dangers that would result from a failure to elect a president according to the Constitution. Iran and Iraq are now negotiating under UN auspices to bring an end to 8 years of bloody and destructive war in the Gulf. The results of these talks will have a profound influence on the entire region. Ballistic missiles and chemical weapons continue to proliferate. The use of chemical weapons by both sides in the Gulf War and Iraq's use of these weapons against the Kurds are grim reminders of the dangers these weapons pose to the conduct of international relations. In Afghanistan, Soviet troops are withdrawing. The people of Afghanistan look forward to the end of Soviet intervention. So, the fact of change is less important than the uses made of change. The Arab-Israeli conflict does not stand still, but there are enduring realities that point to a method for resolving the conflict. The Arab-Israeli conflict is not intractable. Negotiations can bring about peace. No matter what new situations or difficulties Arabs and Israelis face as they approach negotiations, one thing is certain once they get there. They will confront some enduring realities that shape the rules of the negotiations and the outlines of a fair settlement that negotiations can be expected to produce. What are the principles that underlie a comprehensive settlement of the Arab-Israeli conflict? The existence, security, and well-being of Israel are the first principles of any settlement. Israel has the right to exist, and it has the right to exist in security. We will do our utmost to ensure it. The requirements of security need to be understood clearly. These include military hardware, defensible geographic positions, and technological know-how. The United States has cooperated with Israel on these elements, and that cooperation will continue. But these are not the only critical components of Israel's security. Real security results from resolving political differences that continue to fuel conflict. The location of borders is important, but more important is what crosses those borders. Ideas, goods, people, instead of armies and weapons. Borders need to be secure and recognized, but political differences between the neighbors also need to be resolved through compromise. Palestinian political rights must also be recognized and addressed. Palestinians want more than the basic necessities of life. They want, and they are entitled to, political participation and influence over political and economic decisions that affect their lives. This can occur if opportunities for peace and dialogue are seized. A third enduring reality is that the history, security, and destiny of Israelis, Jordanians, Palestinians, and Egyptians are inextricably bound together. Jordan is a vibrant and heterogeneous society with a strong national identity of its own. It is not a Palestinian state. An enduring settlement must reflect the reality that strong, open relations will need to exist among Israeli, Palestinian, Jordanian, and Egyptian peoples. A critical and enduring reality is that negotiations work. 10 years ago, Egypt and Israel forged a treaty of peace that has survived enormous strains. They continue to demonstrate that dialogue and negotiations resolve differences between peoples far better than war and violence. American efforts to bring about negotiations are rooted in these enduring principles. Our approach seeks a comprehensive and durable settlement grounded in United Nations Security Council Resolutions 242 and 338. It calls for direct negotiations, launched if required through an international conference. It requires acceptance of 242 and 338 and renunciation of violence and terrorism. As regards the West Bank and Gaza, our approach highlights the need for a transitional period to help the parties adjust to working with each other to implement an agreement. It recognizes the relationship in time and substance between the transitional period and final status agreement. It affirms the right of Palestinians to participate actively in every stage of negotiations, and it reflects the strategic reality of Jordanian-Palestinian interdependence. This has been the American approach to negotiations. The purposes of this effort have been clear. First, the objective is comprehensive peace between Israel and all its neighbors, achieved through negotiations based on United Nations Security Council Resolutions 242 and 338. This will require the exchange of territory for peace. It will require recognition that sovereignty cannot be defined in absolute terms. Today, borders are porous. Openness is required for the free movement of ideas, people, and goods. There will need to be a border demarcation, but not a wall established between peoples. The territorial issue needs to be addressed realistically. Israel will never negotiate from or return to the lines of partition or to the 1967 borders. but it must be prepared to withdraw, as Resolution 242 says, from territories occupied in the recent conflict. Peace and security for all sides are at stake. Second, peace between Israel and its neighbors will need time and growing mutual goodwill to succeed. In the case of the West Bank and Gaza, this means there must be a transitional period. All sides need to deal with one another gradually, in the light of an agreement freely negotiated. All need time to adjust to a new situation. Palestinians need to achieve rapid control over political and economic decisions that affect their lives. Israelis need time to adjust to a new situation, one in which Palestinians, not Israeli military government officials, administer the West Bank and Gaza. The concept of transition is vital and far-reaching. Many of its elements have already been worked through and accepted by Israel. These transitional arrangements are extensive and dramatic. They can be implemented quickly. Such transitional arrangements will benefit from the interplay with final status negotiations. Each party needs to know the principles that will define the final settlement. As those principles are hammered out in negotiations, they will enhance the transitional arrangements themselves. Each element strengthens the other. This is the essence and benefit of interlock between transitional arrangements and final status. Direct negotiations are at the heart of this negotiating process. No party should be expected to trust its vital national security interests to any mechanism except direct talks. How better to engage an adversary, take his measure, assess intentions, and probe for openings, than to square off across the table? Direct talks work. In the Arab-Israeli conflict, an international conference may also be necessary to ease the entry of the parties into direct negotiations. This conference would also be in a position at the right time to deal with important region-wide issues, such as economic development, joint resource sharing, and humanitarian concerns. But only the right kind of conference should take place, one that helps launch and support direct negotiations without interfering in them. Palestinian participation is required at every stage of the negotiations. Palestinians have a vital stake in the outcome of negotiations. They must have a say in the negotiations themselves, and they must approve the outcome. Participation involves responsibilities, however. There are no free rides. All parties must demonstrate their desire to make peace. They must be creative and reliable. They must adhere to internationally accepted principles and norms. For Palestinians, this means acting credibly and pursuing goals that are achievable. No participant in a peace process can wave the flag of justice in one hand and brandish the weapons of terrorism in the other. All participants must renounce violence and terrorism. Each must agree to negotiate on the accepted international basis of Security Council Resolutions 242 and 338. There are also no free rides for outside parties that want to play a role in settling the conflict. Both the United States and the Soviet Union consider a settlement of the conflict to be in their national interest. But the Soviets will need to confront some difficult choices. There is no longer any excuse for the Soviets to avoid such important steps as resuming full diplomatic relations with Israel, nor is there justification for preventing Jews who wish to emigrate from doing so. The sooner these things are done, the better for the peace process. The challenge of Arab-Israeli peacemaking in a time of change is to find the right mix of fundamental realities and creative ideas. The question is how to assess some of these ideas at this time. Peace cannot be achieved through the creation of an independent Palestinian state or through permanent Israeli control or annexation of the West Bank and Gaza. At the same time, each party is free to bring any position it chooses to the negotiating table. Israelis are free to argue for annexation. Palestinians are free to argue for independence. The United States will not support either of these positions during negotiations. The status of the West Bank and Gaza cannot be determined by unilateral acts of either side, but only through a process of negotiations. A declaration of independent Palestinian statehood or government in exile would be such a unilateral act. Palestinians need to decide whether to remain a part of the problem in the Middle East or become part of the solution. History will not repeat itself. Practical, realistic steps by Palestinians are required. An attempt by Israel to transfer Palestinians from the West Bank and Gaza would also be a unilateral act to determine the status of these territories. The United States would oppose this vigorously. Such a policy does not provide a solution to the problem, nor does it bring negotiations any closer. It is also not acceptable to shift the focus from what Palestinians or Israelis need to do to advance the peace process to what the United States should do. This applies to those who urge that the United States should support Palestinian self-determination. The United States cannot accept self-determination when it is a code word for an independent Palestinian state or for unilateral determination of the outcome of negotiations. To expect the PLO to accept resolutions 242 and 338 as the basis for negotiation is not to ask it to make a concession. Those resolutions lay out basic principles which the international community has decided must be reflected in a peace settlement. In addition to these, the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people, including political rights, must also be addressed. It is through acceptance of these principles, not through any action by the United States, that the Palestinians can participate fully in determining their own future. In the Arab-Israeli conflict, there is no objective reality and no immutable set of circumstances that cannot be shaped by decisions for peace. During the period ahead, such decisions are required. Israelis and Palestinians themselves must condition the environment for negotiations. They can start down the road to accommodation and reconciliation. Violence has distracted people from establishing achievable objectives. Political debate must replace violence. Concrete actions on the ground are required. Palestinians must renounce terrorism and violence. They must accept the right of Israel to exist in peace and present themselves as a viable negotiating partner. They cannot murder or threaten other Palestinians who maintain contact with Israeli authorities. For its part, Israel has the responsibility to maintain law and order in the West Bank and Gaza. But Israel must also find a way to respond to expressions of Palestinian grievances. It cannot claim there is no one to talk to while suppressing political expression and arresting or deporting those who speak out, even those who speak in moderate terms. There must also be actions on the regional level. The peace treaty between Egypt and Israel is a strategic anchor of the entire peace process. It must constantly be enhanced. Relations between Israel and other Arab states must start down the road to normalization. Relations between people don't need to await the formality of a treaty. Israelis and Arabs should find ways to talk to each other now, even before treaty relations exist. The conditions under which refugees live in the region must also be addressed. Poverty is no ally of peace. The continuing existence of refugees does not make the case for Palestinian nationalism stronger. Palestinian refugees can live in better conditions, even while the search for peace continues. Arabs and Israelis, together with the international community, must shoulder this responsibility. Finally, there must be a change of attitude throughout the region. The way people think affects the way they act. Cynicism, skepticism, and pessimism about peace must be shaken. The conflict must be seen to be resolvable. Once there is the will for and belief in a settlement, the benefits of peace will be seen to outweigh the real but transitory risks of achieving it. So, fundamental realities persist, even in the midst of change. The goals of the peace process have not changed, nor have the principles of negotiations. Indeed, the only thing that needs to change is the willingness of people in the Middle East to move the peace process forward. Israelis, Palestinians, Jordanians, Syrians, and Lebanese can make peace happen. The Egyptians are more than ready to do their part. So are we, and so are others around the world. The opportunities today are greater than before, and so are the risks of doing nothing. To make peace, the parties must exploit the new opportunities created by the current ferment, and they should start now. Thank you. That's such an exhaustive treatment of the subject, I doubt if there are any questions. But if there are, I'd be glad to try them. Yes.
Secretary, Robert Greenberg of the Wall Street Journal. Do you see anything in Chairman Arafat's address the other day in France that suggests or signals to you that the Palestinians are moving in the direction you're describing here? And specifically, do you see any basis for Resolution 181 as being part of any Middle East settlement?
Well, the answer to your first question is no. We don't see that there was anything much in that speech. In fact, in tone, it sort of went backwards from the earlier informal statement. I had a formulation in my speech that dealt with 181. That is, I don't see that return to the lines of so-called partition anymore, that return to the 67 borders represents something that's reasonable to expect the Israelis to do.
Secretary, you talked about the interlock between transitional and final status negotiations, but it struck me that one of the problems is that the parties to those final status negotiations do have no common ground about what they see as the ultimate solution. They tend to define it on both sides in terms that tend to exclude the other's vision of a final status settlement. And I think in Camp David the notion was that transitional arrangements, a long transitional period, would provide that confidence-building time in which you could deal with the final status arrangements later on after both sides came to terms with each other. I wonder how you see your proposition addressing that problem of these conflicting objectives.
Well, that theory has had quite a long chance, and it hasn't produced a change. And perhaps one of the reasons is that on the Arab side, they have questioned whether the transition arrangements are intended to be transition, or whether the intention is that some sort of a regime be produced that doesn't change the so-called final status conditions, but somehow involves the Arabs in administering the occupied territories. So they resist. And I think it's easy to understand that, particularly given some of the positions taken by leaders of Israel. At the same time, I think that, difficult though they may be, if people do see that final status issues are being addressed in a reasonable way, then they will have confidence that transition arrangements are exactly what are described, transition. And so they will be ready to try to make them work. In part because it will have a vast impact on the quality of life, and in part because they'll want to create the conditions that will lead to confidence in decisions that may otherwise look bold in final status. So I think there is a very genuine interplay. I completely agree with the concept that that confidence can be built by the kind of transition arrangements that are envisaged, and that will help final status negotiations. But I think the reverse is also true, and therefore we have advocated an interlock between these things. And I think if the parties are ready to sit down and talk about final status, it should happen. And I think that it will be necessary to do that if the transition arrangements are really to get off the ground.
Mr. Secretary, you've identified the proliferation of ballistic missiles and chemical weapons as a threat to the interests of the United States and those of our allies. Building upon the Missile Technology Control Regime and the Aero Research Program, which obviously has a long way to go, what new initiatives can we work together on to move forward to confront these looming dangers?
Well, what we are doing is, first, we and our some of our allies, 7 countries altogether, have created what you referred to as a ballistic missile control regime, where we undertake with each other to control any sales, not to make any sales, and to control the technology, components, and so forth. That's number one. That's in place, and it's getting worked on, and it's new, so we have to articulate it and work it, and that's taking place. Second, obviously those countries are not the only ones that know how to produce ballistic missiles. Right now, the Soviets obviously do, and we see that the Chinese do as well. So, in consultation with our friends, we have gone to the Soviet Union and said, here is a threat. Just as we came together to create the nuclear non-proliferation regime, ballistic missiles now constitute also a proliferation threat. So we ought to talk about it and see if there is something that we might agree on together or work out together that will help control this. And at the Moscow summit, the Soviets agreed to start that process of discussion. And those discussions will, the first round of those discussions will be taking place a week from Monday. After my meetings with Mr. Shevardnadze, there will be another round, a first round of that discussion. In the meantime, we have made a lot of public comments, and we've had a lot of private discussion with the Chinese about this subject. And I think, without going into it in great detail, which wouldn't be appropriate, I'm sure we have their attention. And we have had some real progress now in our discussions with the Chinese on this subject. Whether we will be able to start some talks on the same nature as with the Soviets remains to be seen, but I hope that we may get agreement to do that. So we need to go to the countries that have ballistic missile technology and work to get it controlled, and that's what we're doing. In the meantime, we have been banging away at not selling it, and we have made our views known to some countries where we have information that such missiles are under development and trying to get control of it. I believe that the three most destabilizing weapons around right now are nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, and ballistic missiles to deliver them with. And so we have a regime on nuclear weapons that has served us well for the past 25 years, and it hasn't worked perfectly, but the situation today is far different than what people predicted way back then. So it has had a very constructive and good impact. We're trying to put together something, obviously not exactly the same, but the same basic idea in the ballistic missile field, as I've outlined. And in the case of chemical weapons, there has been for some time at the CD in Geneva negotiations on this subject. And I believe there needs to be a lot more steam put into that. We talk about it regularly with the Soviets, and I'm sure we'll talk about it next week when Shevardnadze is here. And I think we need to see if there aren't ways in which we can dramatize and speed up work on that, because that is a field where there is, I think, evidence of considerable proliferation, and it's very dangerous.
I know it may be hard for you to forget that you're dealing with mega issues 7 days a week. How do you feel just as a human being when an Arab is killed by other Arabs on the West Bank because he expresses any moderation toward settlement with Israel or discussions with Israel?
Well, I said in my speech, I'll reread the sentence. I already commented on that, and so I'm just showing I thought of that question.
I'm not asking you about your speech. I'm asking about how you feel as an individual, not a...
I don't like to see anybody get killed, and when a person does something constructive and gets killed for it, I think it's terrible. And when a man named al-Masri was accepted to be mayor of Nablus 2 or 3 years ago, and for his trouble he was murdered, that was a terrible, violent act. It was an act that shows that peace has its enemies. And what we need to do is create an environment where the enemies of peace are outcasts.
Now that King Hussein has renounced any claim to the West Bank, I was wondering, who do you expect will be a spokesman for the Arabs if they ever do sit down and talk with the Israelis?
Well, in the first place, King Hussein is the head of a country that has the longest border of any with Israel. So if there's going to be peace between Israel and Israel's neighbors, King Hussein is involved. In the second place, the population of Jordan has a very heavy proportion of Palestinians who are related in one way or another. We talked about the mayor that got killed. One of his relations is the foreign minister of Jordan, just to take an example. So to say that these people don't have any relationship is artificial. I think in the end we need to recognize that if you envisage a successful peace process, you have to envisage a situation where the relationships between the people of Israel and Jordan, the Palestinians, the Egyptians for that matter, are in some ways interwoven. Perhaps, as Teddy Kollek would put it, as a mosaic. Not the U.S. melting pot concept, but in terms of a mosaic. A mosaic can be very beautiful too.
What role will Syria and, on the other side, Saudi Arabia play in any kind of Middle East settlement?
Syria, I think, has two particular, or maybe more, things. Number one, of course, they do have a border and a dispute with Israel about the Golan Heights, and that will have to be resolved if there's to be peace between Israel and Syria. So there is a negotiation there between those two countries. That's a direct thing. Second, Syria is an influential voice in Arab circles, and so Syria needs to somehow accept the fact that if it is possible to work out satisfactory relations somehow, or an agreement, a way of negotiating about the West Bank and Gaza, that it is not going to try to disrupt it. It's a second thing. And of course, a third thing that we see very much in play right now are questions of Lebanon, in which Syria has a great influence and presence. And there are clearly things it could do that would be more constructive there.
Two-part question that's related. You have said that annexation is not acceptable to us. And you have also said that an independent Palestinian state is not acceptable. What is left between those extremes except some form of autonomy lacking sovereignty, which the Palestinians have made abundantly clear would not be acceptable to them? The second part of the question, which is the same kind of problem.
My memory is terrible. You have to let me answer the first part of the question, or I'll forget it.
My memory is not so
I've
good.
already forgotten it. Just how a solution would emerge, I can't say. I can tell you what I don't think will work. I would imagine some people will advocate this if there is a negotiation, and I hope there would be one. People will take positions at the beginning of the negotiations, or whatever position they want to take. And I suppose under the circumstances it would be surprising if the Palestinians didn't make a run at an independent Palestinian state, but I don't think it will ever sell. So where do you go from there? I suppose you go to something that gives a sense of identity, but nevertheless also affiliates that identity somehow with states in the region, one or more. But just how these ingenious people in the Middle East will work their way through that, I don't know. I think for us to sit here in the United States and design plans is kind of futile and presumptuous when we go too detailed. The people in the Middle East are terribly smart. They have thought about all of this. They think about it all the time. There's hardly anything you can think of that hasn't been thought of before. And your problem as you work at this, and as we have worked at our own initiatives, is to see if there are some ways of combining things that are a little different, and perhaps get people started. And if they ever get started and working at it with all of the ingenuity there are all sorts of things that can be created. I personally have talked with most of the leaders, all of the key leaders, rather intensively. You know, in conversations where you sit after dinner and sip coffee or something and talk. And I am absolutely convinced in my bones that if ever you could get a honest-to-goodness, good-faith negotiation going, there's an answer there to be found, and those people can find it. But I couldn't tell you offhand what it is. It'll have to be what they find. Even if I could tell you, it wouldn't mean anything, because the negotiating process is terrifically important to this. And it is the outcome that they work out that will work. Even though maybe you would be smart enough to design them something that would be theoretically better. It won't work unless they work it out themselves. That's what direct negotiations are for. But it's there to be found. I'm absolutely convinced of it. Now, what was your second part of your question?
I've forgotten it.
Maybe one more question? Okay, you pick him, or her.
Jonathan Spalter, McNeil-Lehrer NewsHour. Mr. Secretary, in your address you noted that the Soviets should move more rapidly towards resumption of diplomatic relations with Israel. In your prognosis, what would be the prospects of a new and more vigorous Soviet role in the region? And in your view, what would be the consequences of it to present and future negotiations that are at work?
Well, I think the Soviets, for openers, could lean on the Syrians and lean on the PLO, with whom they presumably have some influence. And maybe to some extent they are. I have had the experience myself, even in the last 2 or 3 years, of discussing with the Soviets. We've had an awful lot of time. We've worked at these things. Certain problems, including regional problems, and see them go through a process, our discussion go through a process where it starts out very stiff and is damage control at best, and move into something that is a little bit more free interchange of information, and on into something that really begins to make contact with the problem, and then see us improve the situation somewhat. We had, over the years, some good discussions on the Iran-Iraq war, and these were part of what led to the unanimous UN Security Council Resolution 598, and I think probably that helped some, as did some of the latter stages of our discussions about Afghanistan. Similarly, we've had discussions about Southern Africa off and on for quite a while, and in the last year and a half they have intensified, and now we have those discussions. Chet Crocker does prior to the sessions that he's been holding, and we find the Soviets have somebody sitting on the sidelines there as we're basically doing the helping to conduct the talks, and it's worked quite well. They have been very cooperative and helpful. So I don't rule that out, but I think there is an understandable reluctance to really accept the good faith of a country that doesn't extend full diplomatic relations to Israel under these circumstances. They recognize Israel, but they do not extend full diplomatic relations. Why not? And there is this very sore subject of the treatment of Jews in the Soviet Union and restrictions on immigration. And I must say that headway has been made on those. Both of these subjects we have discussed endlessly, and we have seen some very considerable changes in the last year and a half particularly, and we do now see a little better situation in terms of the relationship. There are meetings between foreign ministers, and there has been a Soviet consular team in Israel for some time. There's now an Israeli consular team in the Soviet Union, and it isn't doing all the things that it would like to do, but it's different from what the situation was a year ago. So there is some motion. Well, thank you very much. I know you're anxious to get to dinner, so go ahead.
In the opening of the Washington Institute's Presidential Study Group report, we quote from the Bible, Ethics of the Fathers 2:20. "The day is short, the task is great. It is not up to you to finish the work, but you are not free to desist from it. This wise saying could well have been the guiding principles that you followed as Secretary of State. We thank you so much for being with us this evening, for sharing your thoughts with us. Most of all, we thank you for your dedicated and inspired leadership and service to our country. Thank you so much.